welcome everyone. Great to see you all here, speakers, guests, London Business School team, Alumni Energy Club. So a few weeks ago, I opened the London Climate Action Week website looking for events about the ocean or blue economy, and I couldn't find any, so I decided to organize this one. And luckily, since then, a few events appeared. But I was actually wrong, because any discussion about the climate could be a discussion about the ocean.
We are now going to be talking about the fascinating area of offshore wind. It's a dual-edged sword. We do need to have focus on offshore wind. Renewable energy is vital for the energy transition. However, we're putting large pieces of spinning metal and other bits of infrastructure onto ocean floors, and it needs to be something that's done with sensitivity to the environment. And thankfully, that is something that the wonderful panel here spent a lot of time thinking about. You could be doing anything. Why are you doing this?
Hi there. So I'm Helen Elphick. I work for a company called RWE, which is one of the larger offshore wind developers in the world. I've been there for the last sort of 9 months or so working on their innovations related to offshore wind farms. But I've worked with the offshore wind sector for the last 15 years or so, and in the marine sector for quite a bit longer than that. And the reason I do it is that I think I was 7 when the Exxon Valdez hit rocks in Newfoundland and spilt oil everywhere. I was 12 or 11 when the Brer did the same in Shetland. And a few years later, the Sea Empress in Pembrokeshire caused absolute enormous environmental devastation. And those stayed with me. And so the first part of my career was cleaning up oil spills. And then a few years into that, I thought, wouldn't it be better if we could use our seas to generate energy in a better way and put our energy into that rather than cleaning up the mess from oil spills? So that's why I do what I do.
Same question?
Thank you, Chris. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm Celestia. I work for RenewableUK, and I manage a program of work which looks at how to make consenting, the planning system, and environment matters better for the offshore wind sector. The reason I'm doing this is, what else would I be doing? It's the huge problem. The climate emergency is real. Net zero needs to happen. And this is where I think that I can make the biggest impact.
Okay, so Celestia, we just started up with context. So obviously offshore wind we all know it's important, but we also, I think, all recognize it's going through a really, really tough time at the moment. There's been stories of cancellations of projects across the globe, but particularly talking about it in the UK context, how important is offshore wind now for the energy transition in the UK, and how important is it likely to be in the future?
Thank you. So to start off with some of the context about why it's important for the UK, offshore wind is a really key part of getting to net zero. It's been identified as what was a really big part of the clean energy mix by the Climate Change Committee, who are saying that we need about 140 gigawatts of offshore wind to meet net zero. To put that into context, at the moment we have 15, and that's been a huge amount of very expensive, very complicated development. We've got targets from our government to meet 50 gigawatts by 2030, which is, again, a hugely ambitious target. Putting that, again, into context, 1 gigawatt is the equivalent of a nuclear power plant, so an enormous amount of energy. And the wind farms that we're talking about, the big ones that are being constructed at the moment, for example, Hornsea 3 off the east coast of England, is the size of half of London when you look at by the area. So really enormous, substantial infrastructure. To talk a bit about why that's complicated, we need to think about the planning system. So I wonder if anyone in the room has ever interacted with the planning system, whether to get a conservatory done or their fence fixed or whatever. I imagine that your experience of that was already not simple. If you could multiply that by the amount of jurisdictions that you're in, the different nations sometimes, the intertidal, marine and terrestrial space, joining all that up, getting a grid connection, getting your funding sorted, really, really challenging. And so that's why these projects are taking over 10 years sometimes from conception to operation to deliver. And we have to get better at that. So, that's the context.
Yeah, and just to put it again in context, like these things, it's really hard to get your head around the scale. But if you think about the Millennium Eye, the London Eye, that is this types of scale of the blade, and you've got dozens of these in front of you. Like these are enormous pieces of equipment. So obviously the planning is really quite difficult. But the other part of it is the ecological impact. So could we talk a little bit about what the ecological impact of these is, like what we know about, and also what we don't know about? Do we fully understand?
Yeah, so this is an ever-changing kind of topic. I think when I started working on offshore wind farms, best part of 20 years ago, there was a lot of focus, rightly so, on bird and marine mammal impacts, and that is still very much a topic. We've moved from just thinking about the direct collisions to thinking about the impacts of birds not being able to access feeding grounds and potentially then the second-order impacts of one colony restocking another colony. And so the complexity of how we think about bird issues has grown from just the direct bird colliding with turbine to consider a lot more issues. We're working on solutions for those, which we'll probably come back to later. But then as well as those kind of well-known topics, there's all sorts of new topics coming through, like the impact, actually, we touched on it earlier, of water mixing. And if you put multiple structures into the sea, does that change the way the water mixes? And are we going to see an impact on the plankton through that, and then an impact to the wider food web? So there's lots of new topics coming through, as well as still finding solutions to the original topics at a bigger scale as we put more and more projects in the sea.
And what are the unknown unknowns? Like what are the new areas that we're looking at and trying to understand a bit better?
I think it's the knock-on impacts. So, because our oceans are an incredibly amazing but complex system, you change one thing here. So, you might change the number of marine mammals or birds, and they're obviously a key predator. And then that has knock-on impacts to other species, which may be positive for some species and negative for others. And then that goes on and has knock-on impacts for others. So it's all of those changes, as well as the cumulative impacts of multiple industries in the same space at the same time. You used to be able to look at projects relatively isolated, and you can't do that now because there's so much happening in the same area. So I think it's all of those system impacts that are the unknown unknowns.
And Celestia, so just digging into that a little bit more, like you work to offset and compensate on the impacts of these kind of interconnections. Like, how do we start to think more holistically about offshore wind and ecology?
So I think we have to think about offshore wind as one actor on the system, and there are many other actors and marine users that have different impacts. We've heard a lot about fishing. We've heard about the navigation sector, about all sorts of different ways that the humans have had an impact on the marine environment. And offshore wind is a small part of this. I can say that as part of the sector, but also as someone who's seen the data and seen the surveys that we do. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's not, I would say, very much conclusive proof that there is any real significant impact compared to many other sectors and how they work. I think from an environment perspective, we need to be thinking at that ecosystem level. We need to understand what's happening at the ecosystem level, but we also need to be able to mitigate and compensate at that level too, because often it's much less important to do something very specific in that tiny area where your actual infrastructure is, and much more important to target areas which would most benefit from conservation actions. And then we talk about sort of enhancement and conservation in the marine environment, but we should think about passive and active restoration. And so passive restoration where you restrict activities and you let nature support itself. And active restoration where, for example, you introduce oysters, seagrass, other sort of ecosystem builders, which are things that companies can actively do to intervene. At the moment, where offshore wind the sector are being targeted to intervene is sort of quite species-specific, quite habitat-specific, which isn't necessarily where I think the most good would come from lots of developer funding being targeted to an area. So I think we're, at the moment, going slightly down the wrong alley.
Okay. And speaking of, no, hold on to the microphone for a bit, Saskia. So speaking of going down the wrong alley, I think we couldn't have an offshore wind panel without discussing really the elephant in the room, which is we're not managing to get any built. Like we did have a significant auction recently, of which there were 0 takers. It doesn't sound like policy support is in the right place. Like, what are the biggest challenges that the industry is facing?
Well, it's as I mentioned, it's a really complex system, and that's why these projects take so long to consent. I wouldn't quite say that we're not building them. There's a lot that's in the pipeline now, and there's lots of construction planned for next year. And with any industry that sort of scales up so rapidly, of course, there's going to be challenges. I would say from a policy perspective, the big challenges are getting the funding right and giving that confidence for investment over the really long scale time periods that the industry needs security, so that's 35, 40 years plus. We need to be much better from a UK perspective about sorting out marine spatial planning and understanding where projects should go, where they shouldn't go, and how to all join that up so that there's advantages for both nature and renewable energy. We also need to work on grid. At the moment, the UK, like many other countries, is focused around sort of centralised grid connections where we've had, coal and oil and gas-fired power stations. Renewable energy means that energy is much more diverse and in different areas to where it was previously, which means we need a whole amount of work to fix that connection.
And is it too simplistic to say that they just got the pricing wrong? That the last round failed because you had a wrong kind of a wrong pennies per kilowatts price there, or was it more to it?
Yes, it was. I think the government were hoping that there's been a huge price decrease for offshore wind over the past 20 years as the industry has matured. So it's halved and halved and halved again, essentially. And I think they were thinking that it would continue to halve, even though industry were making noises saying the opposite, which is where there was a bit of misalignment, I think, between what government wanted in terms of cheap energy and the reality, for example, from the supply chain and the global security risks that the UK was facing as well.
So Helen, if we can dig into technology for a little bit now, I'm really interested in the idea of resilience in the case of offshore winds and in marine ecology. And normally when we talk about resilience, we mean us in terms of like humans and our own survival in the climate crisis. What does it mean in this context?
Yeah, so I think it's about the ability to withstand shocks and unexpected incidents. So actually, oil spills are quite a good example of this. In a healthy environment, the ocean is naturally resilient. Yes, you get some immediate impacts on the species that are most affected by oil, but actually the microorganisms will eat the oil. It goes into the food chain, and in many cases, over time, that environment will recover. The species will rebalance. But if you're working in an environment like our North Sea now, which is so degraded, you've lost all of the resilience. And so I think what we need to do is to find ways to actively bring diversity of species and hotspots for biodiversity back in so that we can build back up from the coasts and offshore that kind of network with all of the different age classes of fish. At the moment, we see lots of small ones, not enough larger ones. Sort of really giving that resilience, that sort of ability to cope when something goes wrong, because things will keep going wrong. That's life. But historically, that's always been the case, and our ecosystems have adapted. But we've stressed them so much now that they can't adapt.
And practically, how are you going about solving that problem?
So, one of the things we're looking at a lot is using the wind farm infrastructure as an opportunity to actively restore nature and passively, actually. So providing a variety of habitats that species can settle within, colonize onto, and then that can help over time. It becomes passive, and it just helps to build up a sort of a much more diverse ecosystem, but also actively looking at which species should be there that aren't now. So lobster hatcheries, for example, and taking baby lobsters into wind farm areas and using the fact that you've got infrastructure there as a way to protect things, as well as looking at how to reduce any negative impacts on your birds and mammals. So We're working on active collision avoidance systems to kind of guide birds, especially in bad weather, of where the turbines are, so that they can fly around and avoid losing birds. And also same for new species like bats, which it turns out migrate across the North Sea, and we're doing lots of research at the moment to understand that better and how to help them to stay away.
And I guess that leads us on to the idea of kind of data-inclusive design. What's the role of data-inclusive design in the coming trends?
Nature-inclusive design, which I think is the principle of designing the things that we need to build anyway, with nature in mind. And so at the moment, we're mostly looking at things like the protection we need to put around wind turbine foundations to help them to stay up and not have the sand eroded, and designing structures that instead of using just rock, have those kind of crevices and hidey holes built in. As we go to the next steps, we can look at the monopiles themselves and how we could, instead of having just a straight steel tube, we could design it to have additional structures attached that provide different kinds of habitats. And then we've started as an industry to look at structures outside of the wind farms that might be there for the purpose of growing seaweed, and that can promote a different kind of a community, or nesting structures for birds. And so it's about how you use the space better so that it's better for nature as well as generating the electricity that we need.
Okay, brilliant. Well, it's great to hear about new technologies, but for real change to happen, you need a change in mindset. What would you like to see to get a nature-positive mindset in this type of construction and development?
So we've seen a lot of really great stuff from different offshore wind developers, including RWE, and I used to work for Ørsted, which is another really big developer. And they've got really great ideas. They're working closely with scientists, academics, to get really, really cool, interesting designs put forward. What's missing at the moment is that overarching vision from the UK government of what it wants to see in the marine space. And at the moment, we've got some really restrictive interpretations of current law, which are saying that everything needs to stay at a sort of baseline from the 1980s, which, as we all understand, is a very degraded baseline. So, for example, if you've got some sandy mud, it's a bad thing if someone goes and puts some oysters on it, if it's in a protected site, because that is an intervention that takes it away from that original baseline. So reframing the laws and the policy to support nature-inclusive design, to do something like, for example, the Netherlands have done, which is to sort of work with their government to issue a nature-inclusive design catalogue, targeting specific species that they want, would be something super positive. As well as that, it comes back to my previous point on when offshore wind developers are asked to compensate or mitigate or enhance the environment, that there is a strategy for how they are directed to do that. So that they do that, they direct that funding into the best possible places for the marine environment. At the moment, we talked about compensation briefly, but some developers are spending tens of millions on bird nesting towers because of a small number of potential kittiwake collisions, for example. What would be much better than that is that sort of holistic thinking with academics, with NGOs and so on, about what good interventions might look like and how to actually get those delivered.
Doesn't sound like you're very positive about the state of international governance at the moment. Would that be fair to say?
I would say the UK political environment at the moment is looking very firmly at UK political boundaries, but as we all know, ecosystems don't follow those boundaries. That stems from that problem with the planning system as well, which is, it's all very boundary driven, and that doesn't quite align with nature.
Yeah, would you like to comment on the...
Yeah, I'd love to, because I think there are definitely challenges in the UK, very much, there's an invisible line down the middle of the North Sea, which is really unhelpful. But one of the things we find difficult, actually, is that every country we work in has very, very different priorities, especially for nature. The species migrate across the North Sea, and yet different countries seem to care about different ones, and so that makes it very difficult to have a joined-up approach as a company. And yeah, as Celestia just touched on, the philosophy is incredibly different. And if we could come up with a kind of a system scale, a regional scale approach to restoring nature, it's going to be way more effective, and cross-industry as well, way more effective than each industry and each country having its own priorities. So, yeah.
Do you think we'll hit our offshore wind goals?
I think we will, yeah. And, to use another industry as a comparator, I mean, solar has outperformed its goals time and time and time again. And offshore wind, we were talking earlier about the challenges that we've had with the most recent auction round. I mean, that's almost due to the success of previous rounds where the cost came down quicker than anyone predicted. And so I think we're having a difficult time now, but it is an incredibly important and valuable way of generating clean electricity. So I do think that, we will hit those goals and probably go past them.
And what do we need to happen to hit the goals?
So the big thing for me is about proper collaboration between different people working in the system. So between the different industries, between academia, between governments, between large companies like mine, but also those small innovators, and really finding a way for us to put the puzzle pieces, which I believe are out there, but they're just not assembled into one joined up ocean picture. So back to Celestia's point really about having a clear vision and then a network so that the people who hold those puzzle pieces can actually put them together on the page.
Okay, just to wrap up, if I could ask both of you to stare into your crystal balls and think in 10 years' time, what do you imagine the difference between the relationship between offshore winds and biodiversity will be then as compared to now?
I think we'll have some really helpful, tangible examples of where we've used offshore wind farms, hopefully in the UK, but if not, at least somewhere else like the Netherlands, to provide this kind of refuge and really demonstrate that it can be a way to restore biodiversity across a much wider area than just the wind farm itself. And I think that will then help to get momentum and to get the policy changing. And I really hope that we will have found a way to get that collaborative network working as well, so that we're properly working together on things.
Celestia?
Thank you. I think it all goes back to what we were previously talking about on the policy point. We need that sort of overarching system architecture to work, like the planning system with marine spatial planning, with grid. And I'm hoping, I think 10 years, we should be able to manage it. That'll be 2 governments away, and there's a lot of thinking to do in between then. But we've got those really bold targets, and there's lots of very, very enthusiastic people, thousands of them across all the companies that we work across, thinking, this is good for the planet, and politicians like it because it's good for business as well. It's good for employment, for skills. So the forces are all aligned. I think it's just getting those bits joined up, or the key components joined up, and we'll get there. Fingers crossed.
Well, yeah, 2 governments and hopefully not like 14 prime ministers during that time. A little bit of consistency would be great. Well, thank you very much. And could everybody please thank this wonderful panel.